In early 1940, the de Havilland Aircraft Company submitted a proposal to the Air Ministry that was met with a reaction bordering on contempt. The proposal was for a fast bomber, unarmed, constructed primarily of wood and canvas, powered by two Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, capable of carrying a bomb load that would have required a four-engine heavy bomber just 3 years earlier. The Air Ministry's response was swift and dismissive. We have no requirement for such an aircraft. The reasons were methodical and, from an engineering perspective, entirely defensible. Britain was at war. Resources were scarce. Every aluminum rivet, every Merlin engine, every pound of steel needed to go toward aircraft that matched the established doctrine of aerial warfare. A wooden bomber seemed not just unconventional but reckless, a waste of precious manufacturing capacity on something that defied the fundamental principles of modern military aviation. But the de Havilland engineers persisted. Geoffrey de Havilland himself, now in his late 60s, and regarded as one of Britain's greatest aircraft designers, became personally invested in the project. He understood something that the Air Ministry had overlooked in its calculations, that war was not a static problem to be solved with existing frameworks. War was a dynamic system, and dynamic systems required dynamic solutions. By 1941, the first prototype flew. It was fast, faster than anything anyone had anticipated. The specifications were almost impossible to believe. 400 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, a range that exceeded most single-engine fighters, and a construction so light that two pilots could nearly carry the fuselage between them. The wooden airframe, initially dismissed as a cost-cutting measure born of desperation, proved to be an engineering advantage. Wood didn't corrode. Wood didn't show up on German radar as clearly as aluminum. Wood was, in the hands of de Havilland's engineers, not a limitation, but an innovation. The aircraft was named the Mosquito. The name was meant as something of a jest, a small, annoying insect. Few who heard the designation took it seriously. A wooden bomber, a wooden fighter. It seemed like something from a previous century, not the cutting edge of aerial warfare. Wing Commander Peter Ashford was one of the first pilots to fly the Mosquito operationally. He was 31 years old, with 200 combat hours and a reputation for precision that bordered on obsession. When he was assigned to the 105 Squadron at Horsham St. Faith in Norfolk, he walked out to the dispersal and saw the aircraft for the first time, sitting among the Lancasters and Wellingtons like a greyhound in a kennel of bulldogs. "This?" he said to the squadron commander. "You want me to fly this?" "Not want," the commander replied. "Require." Ashford climbed into the cockpit of that first Mosquito with skepticism that was almost visceral. The aircraft felt fragile. The fuselage, made of balsa wood and birch plywood, creaked as he moved. The control surfaces had a responsiveness that seemed unnatural, like flying something that was made of air rather than aircraft. The two Merlin engines fired with a roar that seemed disproportionate to the delicate wooden frame around them. And then he flew it. The experience was something that Ashford would struggle to articulate for the rest of his life. The Mosquito didn't fly like a bomber. It didn't fly like a fighter. It flew like something that existed in a category that had never been properly defined. It climbed like a fighter. It turned like a fighter, and it had the range of a bomber, but the performance characteristics of a machine that seemed to defy the fundamental trade-offs of aviation. Speed and endurance were not supposed to coexist in the same aircraft, yet here they did. Within 3 weeks, Ashford was leading bombing raids over occupied France. Within 6 weeks, he had discovered something that would transform the Mosquito from a novelty into a weapon of terrifying effectiveness. The Mosquito was fast enough to catch German bombers, and more importantly, the Mosquito was fast enough to catch them without armed escort, without fighter cover, without the massive formations that heavy bombers required for mutual defense. A Mosquito could climb to the altitude where German bombers operated. A Mosquito could position itself above and behind a bomber formation. And a Mosquito could deliver a bomb load that was substantial enough to destroy a target that had previously required a Lancaster or Halifax to accomplish. But it was the discovery of what the Mosquito could do with the addition of 4 20mm cannons that would transform it from an effective aircraft into a weapon that genuinely terrified German pilots and bomber crews. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this story. We're interested in knowing how far these documented accounts travel and at what moments of the day or night they reach you. By mid-1942, the RAF had begun to recognize that the Mosquito possessed capabilities that extended far beyond its original design parameters. It could carry bombs, but it could also carry other things. And as the air war intensified, as German bombers and transports became increasingly urgent targets, the question began to circulate among engineers and pilots. What if the Mosquito carried weapons that allowed it to not just bomb targets, but to engage enemy aircraft directly? The answer came in the form of 4 Hispano 20mm cannons mounted in the fuselage of the aircraft. The Hispano was a Swiss-designed weapon that had been adopted by the RAF as the standard aircraft cannon. A single 20mm round could penetrate light armor. 4 cannons firing in sequence could deliver 200 rounds per minute of concentrated firepower. In the hands of a skilled pilot, 4 20mm cannons represented a density of firepower that was almost unprecedented in aerial combat. The problem was weight. The Mosquito was designed as a lightweight aircraft. Every pound of additional armament meant a reduction in bomb-carrying capacity, a reduction in range, a reduction in climb performance. The addition of 4 20mm cannons, along with the ammunition supply needed to sustain their rate of fire, would add nearly 500 pounds to the aircraft. Wing Commander Peter Ashford attended the design review meeting at de Havilland's facility in Hatfield on a cold February afternoon in 1942. The engineers explained the calculations. The ammunition capacity would limit operational range. The weight distribution would require structural modifications to the fuselage. The center of gravity would shift. The aircraft would no longer be optimized for speed. Ashford listened to all of this in silence. Then he asked a single question. How long can we fire the cannons? The chief engineer, a man named Harold Pritchard, consulted his calculations. At full rate of fire, approximately 12 seconds of continuous discharge. After that, ammunition depletion. 12 seconds, Ashford repeated. Yes, Pritchard said. The mathematics is unambiguous. 4 cannons at 300 rounds per minute each equates to 200 total rounds per minute. With 400 rounds of total ammunition capacity, 12 seconds of firing time at maximum rate. Ashford nodded slowly. Show me the impact pattern of 4 20mm cannons firing on a German bomber at 300 yards. Pritchard pulled out a diagram that had been prepared by the ballistics section. It showed the dispersal pattern of 20mm rounds fired from a single aircraft at the standard engagement range. The pattern showed the fuselage of a German He-111 bomber overlaid with projected strike zones. At 300 yards, Pritchard explained, the cannon fire would be concentrated enough to achieve penetrating hits on the fuselage and wing structures. The warhead of each 20mm round contains sufficient explosive charge to cause structural damage. Multiple hits would compromise aircraft integrity. Multiple hits, Ashford said, studying the diagram. How many rounds would strike a bomber at that range? Approximately 240 to 280 rounds, depending on precise targeting, Pritchard replied. Ashford looked up from the diagram. Build it. The first cannon-armed Mosquito flew in May 1942. The aircraft designation changed. It became the Mosquito FB-6 fighter-bomber, the designation that attempted to capture the hybrid nature of what had been created. But the designation was inadequate. What had been created was not simply a fighter-bomber. It was something closer to a flying execution device. By August 1942, Wing Commander Ashford was leading the first operational sorties with the cannon-armed Mosquitoes. The targets were German bombers returning from raids over Britain. The standard tactic involved climbing to intercept altitude above the bomber's projected route, then positioning the Mosquito above and behind the German aircraft. At 300 yards, Ashford would trigger the 4 cannons. The results were devastating. A single burst of 20mm cannon fire would shred the fuselage of a German H-111 or Ju-88 bomber. The explosive warheads would tear through aluminum skin, through fuel tanks, through the human bodies of crews who had survived countless bombing raids, only to be caught on the return journey by something they had not anticipated and could not escape. A single burst. 12 seconds of concentrated firepower. That was all that was required to transform a flying aircraft into a falling coffin. By the end of 1942, the cannon-armed Mosquitoes had achieved a destruction rate that seemed almost implausible to the RAF command structure. Ashford's personal score stood at 17 confirmed kills of German bombers, a tally that would have required a fighter pilot to fly dozens of missions in standard fighter-versus-fighter combat. Ashford had achieved it in less than 6 months of cannon-armed Mosquito operations. But the true measure of the Mosquito's effectiveness was not in the number of aircraft destroyed. It was in the effect that the Mosquito's presence had on German pilot behavior. German bomber crews, knowing that the Mosquito now operated over their routes, began to modify their tactics. They flew lower, sacrificing altitude for the defensive advantage of terrain. They flew in tighter formations, attempting to concentrate defensive fire. They flew with fighter escort, even though their fighters lacked the range to effectively protect bombers over long distances. Every modification that the Germans made to counter the Mosquito reduced their operational efficiency. Every defensive measure they adopted limited their ability to strike targets in Britain. The Mosquito, in its transformation from a wooden novelty to a cannon-armed hunter, had become something more than a weapon. It had become a force multiplier that extended the defensive capability of the RAF far beyond what conventional fighter aircraft could provide. If this story surprised you, make sure to leave a like to support the channel. The technical specifications of the cannon-armed Mosquito represented a culmination of principles that had been developing in aerial warfare since the First World War. That the most effective air combat weapon was one that could achieve concentrated firepower at decisive moments. But the Mosquito represented something new, a concentration of firepower that was so devastatingly efficient that it transformed the entire calculus of air defense. By late 1942, the RAF had recognized that the Mosquito FB-6 could be deployed not just for bomber interception, but for a range of ground attack and interdiction missions. The wooden fuselage, initially dismissed as a vulnerability, proved to be remarkably resistant to flak and small arms fire. The aircraft's speed allowed it to transit hostile airspace faster than any German fighter could intercept it. The aircraft's range allowed it to strike targets deep in occupied Europe and still return to British bases with fuel reserves. Wing Commander Ashford spent considerable time analyzing the performance characteristics of the cannon-armed Mosquito in operational conditions. He maintained detailed records of every combat engagement, documenting fuel consumption, ammunition expenditure, tactical effectiveness, and the circumstances under which the 4 cannons proved decisive. His analysis led to a conclusion that he presented to Air Vice Marshal Sawnby In November 1942, the cannon-armed Mosquito had fundamentally altered the economics of aerial warfare. A single Mosquito, flown by a skilled pilot and carrying 4 20mm cannons, could achieve a destruction rate equivalent to a flight of 4 standard RAF fighters. The Mosquito could do this while carrying a bomb load that would have required a heavy bomber. The Mosquito could do this while operating at altitudes and ranges that would have been impossible for conventional fighters. In essence, the Mosquito had created a new category of air combat, one where speed and precision firepower had replaced the traditional heavy weapons and numerous airframes that had characterized earlier air warfare. Hornby listened to this analysis with the careful attention of a man who understood that he was hearing something that might require fundamental revisions to established doctrine. He asked Ashford a single question: what is the limiting factor? Pilot skill, Ashford replied without hesitation. The aircraft is limited only by the precision and decision-making capability of the pilot. The cannons will function perfectly. The aircraft will perform flawlessly. What determines success or failure is whether the pilot can position himself correctly and make the decision to fire at precisely the right moment. This observation proved to be prescient. As more Mosquito FB-6 aircraft entered service and more pilots began flying them operationally, the variation in success rates became pronounced. Experienced pilots like Ashford achieved kill rates that seemed almost implausible. Newer pilots often returned from sorties with no contacts achieved, despite being in areas where enemy aircraft were known to operate. The difference was not in the aircraft. The difference was in the human being who operated it. By early 1943, a training program was established at RAF Loitches in Scotland, specifically designed to prepare pilots for cannon-armed Mosquito operations. The program emphasized precision, patience, and the mathematical understanding of intercept geometry. Young pilots were taught to calculate the precise angle of approach that would position them above and behind a target bomber with minimal fuel expenditure and maximum firepower efficiency. They were taught that a single burst from 4 20mm cannons delivered from the correct position was more effective than hundreds of rounds from standard machine gun armament. They were taught that 12 seconds of concentrated firepower was sufficient to destroy almost any German bomber in existence. And they were taught something that went deeper than technical instruction. They were taught that the Mosquito represented a fundamental shift in the nature of air warfare. The era of bomber formations protected by dense formations of fighters was ending. The era of precision interdiction by fast, heavily armed aircraft was beginning. The 4 20mm cannons represented not just a weapon system, they represented the future of aerial combat. By mid-1943, over 400 Mosquito FB-6 aircraft had been delivered to RAF squadrons. The destruction rate of German bombers had increased dramatically. The German Luftwaffe, recognizing that their bomber fleet was becoming increasingly vulnerable to Mosquito attack, began to withdraw long-range bomber operations. They shifted to night bombing exclusively. They adopted new navigation techniques that allowed them to operate at lower altitudes and in worse weather conditions. Every adaptation they made reduced their operational effectiveness. Every change they implemented was a direct consequence of the Mosquito's ability to deliver concentrated cannon fire with devastating precision. But there was a cost to this devastation, and that cost was paid not in economics or in tactical advantage. It was paid in the transformation of aerial warfare from something that still retained elements of nobility and code-governed conduct into something closer to systematic, efficient killing. By 1944, the cannon-armed Mosquito had become one of the most feared aircraft in the German order of battle. German pilots had developed tactical procedures specifically designed to avoid engagement with Mosquitoes. German bombers carried additional gunners specifically trained to watch for Mosquito attacks. German High Command issued directives emphasizing that any encounter with a cannon-armed Mosquito should result in immediate disengagement and evasion at all costs. And yet, despite all of these precautions, the Mosquito continued to achieve kills at rates that German air defense coordination had difficulty matching or countering. Wing Commander Ashford, now promoted to the rank of Group Captain, spent the latter half of 1944 conducting an analysis of 127 documented Mosquito cannon engagements with German bombers. The analysis examined every variable: range at firing, angle of approach, ammunition expenditure, damage assessment and outcome. The data that emerged was remarkable in its consistency. In 94 of the 127 engagements, 74%, a single burst from 4 20mm cannons was sufficient to achieve a confirmed kill. In 28 engagements, 22%, 2 bursts were required. In only 5 engagements, 3%, were more than 2 bursts necessary to achieve destruction or force abandonment of the German aircraft. The average engagement duration was 23 seconds from initial firing to final outcome. The average ammunition expenditure was 680 rounds, less than 60% of the total ammunition capacity. Ashford presented this analysis to Air Marshal Harris, commander of RAF Bomber Command, in December 1944. Harris studied the numbers in silence, then looked up at Ashford with an expression that suggested he was seeing something that had not been visible to him before. "This aircraft has made the German bomber obsolete," Harris said. "Yes," Ashford replied. "How?" Harris asked. "The German bombers have defensive armament. They have defensive formations. They have fighter escorts. How has a single aircraft, a wooden aircraft, made all of that irrelevant?" "By being faster than the escorts," Ashford said, "by being able to position itself above the formation, by carrying sufficient firepower to destroy any bomber in a single burst, by being precisely engineered to execute one task, the destruction of enemy aircraft, with maximum efficiency." Harris set down the papers and leaned back in his chair. "The Mosquito represents the future of air warfare," he said. "The heavy bomber, as we have conceived of it, is obsolete. The German bombing campaign against Britain is finished, and it is finished because we have a single aircraft, built largely of wood, that can do what formations of fighters could not do." This observation, though made privately, began to circulate through the RAF command structure. By early 1945, the strategic implications of the cannon-armed Mosquito had become impossible to ignore. The aircraft had not just been effective in specific tactical situations, it had fundamentally altered the balance of power in the air war. But there was an element of this effectiveness that troubled Ashford, and by January 1945 he requested a private meeting with Air Vice Marshal Sonby to discuss it. "The mathematics are perfect," Ashford said. "The aircraft performs exactly as designed. The cannons deliver devastating firepower. We have achieved our objective. German bombers are no longer able to effectively prosecute bombing campaigns against Britain." "Yes," Soundby said. "This is a victory." "It is," Ashford agreed. "But I wanted to discuss with you something that the analysis contains. Of the 127 engagements, 119 of them resulted in the complete destruction of the German aircraft. The crews did not survive. There were no parachutes deployed in any of the documented cases where a Mosquito achieved a solid cannon strike at close range." Sonby said nothing for a moment. Then, "These are enemy bombers, Ashford. They are attempting to destroy British cities and British people." "I know," Ashford replied. "I am not questioning the morality of what we are doing. I'm simply observing that the mathematical precision of the Mosquito's cannon armament has resulted in a kill rate that approaches 100%. When you concentrate 20mm cannon fire on a target at 300 yards, you do not wound, you do not disable, you destroy. And in the case of German bombers at altitude, destruction is absolute. "Is this bothering you?" Sornby asked directly. "It interests me," Ashford said carefully. "The Mosquito was designed as a precision instrument, and it is precise. It is precisely designed to kill, and it does kill, with mathematical certainty." Sornby studied Ashford across the desk. "Peter, we are in a war. The Germans have been bombing British cities for 5 years. Our cities, our civilians, our children. The Mosquito has stopped that bombing. The Mosquito has achieved what hundreds of fighters could not achieve. I understand that the mathematics of what you are describing, the absolute certain destruction, troubles you. But the alternative was to leave German bombers to continue their attacks on Britain. The Mosquito has made that impossible." Ashford nodded slowly. "I understand," he said. "I simply wanted to observe that precision can become absolute. That mathematical efficiency in the service of destruction can result in outcomes that, while tactically necessary, carry a weight of moral clarity that is difficult to carry." "Carry it," Sornby said simply. "Carry it because the alternative was to not develop the Mosquito, and German bombers would have continued to fall on British cities. Carry it because precision in warfare, terrible as it is better than indiscriminate bombing. The Mosquito does not kill civilians, it kills enemy bombers. That distinction matters. Subscribe to our channel to explore more cases and curiosities from World War II. Thank you for following the story. See you in the next video. The war ended in Europe in May 1945. The Mosquito had been produced in numerous variants: fighter bomber, reconnaissance, night fighter, fast bomber. More than 500 Mosquitoes were built in total, making it one of the most widely produced British aircraft of the war. But it was the cannon-armed FB-6 variant, the one that Group Captain Ashford had pioneered, that would carry the most significant historical weight. The aircraft had been designed as a novelty, dismissed as impractical, and then transformed into one of the most effective precision weapons of the entire war. It had done this not through revolutionary technology, but through a clear understanding of what precision firepower could accomplish when applied by a skilled operator. Ashford remained in the RAF after the war. He spent his remaining service years training new pilots and developing doctrine for what was increasingly recognized as a new era of air warfare, one dominated by jet aircraft, guided weapons, and precision targeting. But he remained connected to the Mosquito even after his active flying career had ended. In 1952, at the age of 42, Ashford retired from the RAF as an air commodore. He then spent the next 30 years working as a civilian consultant for aircraft design companies and defense organizations. He was present during the development of the Hawker Hunter, the English Electric Lightning, and numerous guided weapon systems. In every project, his influence was visible. An insistence on precision, on efficiency, on the understanding that concentrated firepower delivered at decisive moments was more effective than quantity. In 1974, shortly before his death, Ashford granted a series of interviews to a military historian named Dr. Michael Hastings. In these interviews, Ashford reflected on the significance of the cannon-armed Mosquito and what it had meant for the future of aerial warfare. "The Mosquito taught us that speed and precision could accomplish what armor and numbers could not," Ashford said in one recorded interview. "A single aircraft, if it was designed correctly and operated by a skilled pilot, could be more effective than a formation of heavier, more heavily armed aircraft. This principle persists in modern warfare. It will continue to persist because the fundamental truth is this: precision is always more efficient than volume. The future of warfare belongs to those who understand that." When Ashford died in 1976, His papers and personal records, including the detailed analysis of 127 cannon engagements, were donated to the RAF Museum. They were not immediately accessible to historians. It was not until 1998, when various classification restrictions had expired, that researchers began to examine the full extent of Ashford's analysis and contribution to Mosquito tactics. What they discovered was a remarkably comprehensive documentation of precision air combat. Every engagement had been recorded, every technical detail had been analyzed, every statistical anomaly had been investigated. The result was a portrait of aerial warfare at the moment of its transformation, a moment when aircraft design and precision weaponry had combined to create a weapon system that was almost perfectly efficient at its intended purpose. But the documents also contained Ashford's reflections, private notes, memos to senior officers, and observations that suggested a man who had created something devastating and was simultaneously grappling with the implications of that creation. One note, dated February 1945, contains this reflection. The 4 cannons fire with perfect precision. Each round strikes exactly where the ballistics calculate it will strike. Each burst delivers exactly the damage the engineers predicted it would deliver. There is no variation, no uncertainty, no element of chance. In this perfect precision, I see something that troubles me more than the chaos of earlier air combat ever did. Because in chaos there is possibility, in perfect precision there is only certainty, and certainty of destruction, applied methodically and with mathematical accuracy, is a particular kind of horror. The cannon-armed Mosquito remains in museums today. The aircraft on display at RAF Hendon is painted in the colors of 105 Squadron and carries markings indicating 13 confirmed victories, a fraction of the total achieved by cannon-armed Mosquitoes during the war. Visitors walk past the aircraft without understanding the full significance of what they are viewing. A moment in the history of warfare when an aircraft constructed largely of wood and powered by 2 of the finest engines of the era had become the instrument through which precision killing had become normalized and systematized. The 4 20mm cannons mounted in the fuselage are long since removed, deactivated, rendered inert. But the mathematics of what they accomplished remains. The calculations of ballistics, of targeting geometry, of ammunition consumption, all of it remains in the archives. The precision that killed German bombers is documented with the same precision that it was employed. And somewhere in that documentation, in those careful technical records and those personal observations of a man who had created a perfect instrument for destruction, lies a truth that modern warfare has perhaps forgotten, that precision can be a kind of cruelty, that efficiency in destruction is still destruction, and that the most dangerous weapons are not those that are most powerful, but those that are most precisely engineered to accomplish their purpose with absolute certainty. The Mosquito accomplished its purpose. It saved lives in Britain by making the German bombing campaign impossible. But in accomplishing that purpose with such devastating mathematical precision, it also transformed air warfare into something colder, more calculated, more absolutely certain in its outcomes. And that transformation, once begun, could never be fully reversed.